They thought they could cut me from the project and bury my career right in the middle of an all-hands meeting. They didn't know that in my desk drawer, hidden under a decade of dust, lay a weapon they'd inadvertently handed me. No phone calls, no emails, no threats, just a small clause in an NDA, enough to bring the entire company to its knees. And once that bomb detonated, there would be no turning back. My name is Claire Donovan, and I've spent 12 years building my reputation at Ardent Solutions, brick by careful brick. That Tuesday morning started like any other coffee at 7:30. Emails cleared by 8, ready for the 9 o'clock all-hands meeting. I should have known something was off when Victor Hale, our new project director who'd been hired just 3 months ago, avoided eye contact as I entered the conference room. The meeting space was our largest, a glass-walled fishbowl on the 15th floor that could hold all 70 employees. I took my usual seat near the front, notebook open, pen ready. The morning light streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the polished table. Around me, conversations hummed quarterly projections, client renewals, the usual corporate white noise. Victor stood at the podium, his Armani suit impeccable, that practiced smile stretching across his face like a wound. He cleared his throat, and the room settled into silence. "Before we dive into Q3 results," he began, his voice carrying that false warmth I'd learned to distrust, "we need to address some structural changes in Project Meridian." My spine straightened. Meridian was my project had been for 3 years. I'd nursed it from a concept sketch to our most profitable enterprise account, worth 40% of our annual revenue. "Effective immediately," Victor continued, his eyes finally meeting mine with calculated precision. "Claire Donovan will be transitioning off Meridian to focus on other opportunities within the organization." The words hung in the air like a blade mid-fall. 70 pairs of eyes swiveled toward me, some sympathetic, most simply curious, waiting to see if I'd implode, explode, or dissolve. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, the only sound in a room suddenly thick with anticipation. "Marcus Chen will be taking over as lead," Victor added, that smirk barely contained now. "We believe fresh perspective will accelerate our growth trajectory." Fresh perspective. The phrase tasted like copper in my mouth. Marcus had been with the company 8 months. 8 months versus my 12 years of relationship building, late nights debugging code, flying to Seattle every month to handhold our biggest client through their digital transformation. I felt my fingers grip the pen, knuckles white, but my face remained neutral. This wasn't a reorganization, it was an execution. Public, deliberate, designed to humiliate. No courtesy of a private conversation, no transition plan, no pretense of professionalism, just a corporate beheading in front of the entire company. "Any questions about the transition?" Victor asked the room, though his eyes never left my face, hungry for a reaction, tears, rage, anything he could later spin as emotional or difficult to work with. The silence stretched like pulled taffy. Janet from accounting shifted uncomfortably. Tom from development studied his laptop screen with sudden intensity. Even Marcus looked uncomfortable, color rising in his cheeks as he realized he'd been made an unwitting accomplice to this ambush. I closed my notebook with deliberate slowness, the soft snap echoing in the silence. Standing. I smoothed my skirt, gathered my things with the same precision I'd applied to every project, every presentation, every line of code I'd written for this company. "No questions," I said, my voice steady as granite. Crystal clear. The walk to the door felt like miles, every step measured, spine straight, shoulders back. I could feel Victor's satisfaction radiating behind me, probably already crafting the narrative, difficult to collaborate with, resistant to change, not a team player, the usual corporate character assassination. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that 12 years ago, when Ardent Solutions was just 5 people in a borrowed WeWork space, I'd been more than just an early employee. I'd been the one who'd brought in Northbridge Tech, our first enterprise client. I'd been the one Jonathan Pike, our founder, had trusted with something more valuable than equity or titles. He'd trusted me with leverage. As I reached the door, I turned back once, just long enough to meet Victor's eyes. He was still smiling, mistaking my composure for defeat, my silence for submission. In that moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Thank you for the opportunity to transition, I said, letting the corporate speak roll off my tongue like honey laced with arsenic. I'm sure the fresh perspective will be illuminating. Then I walked out, leaving them to their meeting, their spreadsheets, their illusions of victory. They thought they'd just cut me from the project. They had no idea they'd just lit the fuse. Back at my desk, former desk now, I pulled open the bottom drawer where 12 years of accumulated history lived. Conference badges from Vegas and Seattle. USB drives from when we still used them. A stress ball shaped like a server that Jonathan had given everyone during our first product launch. My fingers found the manila folder at the very back, its edges soft with age, the tab labeled simply Northbridge Amendment in my own faded handwriting. The paper inside had yellowed slightly, corners curled from humidity and time, a single page that had seemed like overcautious legal theatrics back then, when we were desperate for our first real client and would have signed anything. I smoothed it flat on my desk, reading words I hadn't looked at in a decade. In the event that Claire Donovan is removed from Project Meridian, formerly Project Atlas, without documented cause relating to performance, misconduct, or voluntary resignation, all intellectual property rights, client relationship privileges, and associated licensing agreements shall revert to Ms. Donovan as the original architect and relationship owner. The legalese continued for 3 more paragraphs, but the meaning was crystal clear. Jonathan Pike's signature sat bold at the bottom, along with mine and, most importantly, Northbridge Tech's chief legal officer, Margaret Stark. Not just any contract, a binding amendment that superseded the standard agreements, filed with Delaware state records because Jonathan had insisted on doing things properly. I remembered that day with sudden, vivid clarity. Jonathan's corner office in our cramped Tribeca startup space, rain streaming down windows that didn't quite seal properly. He'd called me in at 9:30 at night, eyes red from staring at contracts, his usually perfect hair disheveled from running his hands through it. "They want guarantees," he'd said, sliding the paper across his cluttered desk. "Northbridge is paranoid about personnel changes. They've been burned before, hired a firm, built relationships with the team, then watched everyone get shuffled around 6 months later. They want you locked in." "So lock me in," I'd said, young and eager, not understanding the gift he was giving me. "No," Jonathan had leaned back in his chair, that brilliant strategic mind already playing 3-dimensional chess while everyone else was learning checkers. "We lock them to you. There's a difference. Sign this." I'd read it twice, not quite believing what I was seeing. "Jonathan, this gives me leverage," he'd finished. "It gives you leverage. You're bringing us our first enterprise client, Claire. You've spent 6 months building that relationship, learning their systems, earning their trust. That has value, real, legal, documented value." He gestured at the contract. "This ensures everyone remembers that. Won't the board have issues with this?" Jonathan had smiled then, the expression of someone who'd already won a game others didn't know they were playing. "The board wants Northbridge's $3 million contract. They'll approve anything that makes that happen. And besides..." He'd stood, walking to the window to watch the rain. "I have a feeling that someday, long after I'm gone, this company will forget who built its foundation. When that happens, you'll need protection." The prophecy of it sent chills down my spine now. Sitting in my soon-to-be former office, listening to the distant sound of Victor's voice carrying from the conference room as he continued the meeting I'd been expelled from. Jonathan had left Ardent 5 years ago, bought out by the board when his vision became incompatible with market demands. He'd warned me then, "The vultures are circling. Claire, keep that document safe." I photographed each page with my personal phone, then carefully returned the original to its folder. This would go in the box with my other personal items. Just another piece of old paper among the detritus of a long career. Nothing Victor would think to question, if he even bothered to watch me pack. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. Marcus Wheeler stood in my doorway, his face flushed with embarrassment. The unwitting beneficiary of Victor's coup, promoted into my role without warning or, apparently, desire. "Claire, I had no idea he was going to..." "I know," I said, and meant it. Marcus was a good developer. Probably would have made a decent project lead in a few years with proper mentoring. Now he'd been thrown into the deep end with weights tied to his ankles. Word of advice: read everything, every contract, every amendment, every client communication from the past 3 years. Northbridge particularly values continuity and trust. You'll want to maintain both. He nodded eagerly, grateful for any guidance. I will. And Claire, this isn't right. Everyone knows it. I stood, sliding the folder into my box between a picture frame and my coffee mug collection. Right and wrong don't matter much in corporate America. Marcus, what matters is what's legal and what's binding. I gave him a small smile. Good luck. You'll need it. As he left, I took one last look around the office I'd occupied for 7 years. The whiteboard still covered with my project timelines. The wall where I'd pinned every thank you note from clients. The window with its view of the Chrysler building that I'd watched through countless late nights. Victor thought he'd taken all of this from me. He didn't realize he'd actually set me free and armed me with the very weapon Jonathan Pike had forged all those years ago, waiting for exactly this moment. The cardboard box in my arms weighed nothing compared to the document tucked between my laptop and planner. I moved through the office with deliberate calm, past the cubicle farm where hushed conversations died as I approached, past the break room where 3 junior developers suddenly found their phones fascinating. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, painting golden stripes across the industrial carpet that I'd walked for over a decade. Victor stood near the elevator bank, pretending to study his phone, but I could see him watching my reflection in the polished steel doors. He wanted a scene tears, shouting, maybe even begging. Something he could point to later and say, "See, this is why changes were necessary." I stopped directly beside him, close enough that he had to acknowledge my presence. The elevator dinged, doors sliding open to reveal an empty car. Neither of us moved. "No hard feelings, Claire," he said, that practiced executive sympathy dripping from each word. "Sometimes organizations need to evolve beyond their original players. I'm sure you understand." I shifted the box to one arm and pressed the lobby button, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. Then, without looking at him, I spoke in a voice so quiet he had to lean in to hear it. "Evolution," I said, watching the floor numbers light up in sequence. "Interesting choice of words. Victor, you know what's fascinating about evolution? The species that survive aren't always the strongest or the smartest." I turned to face him then, letting him see something in my eyes that made him take an involuntary step back. They're the ones that adapt to use every resource at their disposal. The elevator doors began to close. He stuck his hand out to stop them, his confident mask slipping for just a moment. "Is that some kind of threat?" I smiled, then not the polite, professional smile I'd perfected over years of client meetings and performance reviews, but something altogether different, something that made him pull his hand back. "Threat number Victor. Just an observation about natural selection. You have a good afternoon." The doors closed on his confused expression, and I descended alone, counting each floor like a countdown to detonation. 15, 14, 13, each number marking my departure from the world above, where Victor believed he'd won. The lobby stretched before me, all marble and modern art, designed to impress visitors with ardent success. Sarah at reception looked up, her face a mix of sympathy and curiosity. I'd hired her 2 years ago, fought for her salary increase last quarter. "Claire, she started. "It's fine, Sarah," I said, meaning it. "Take care of yourself." The revolving door deposited me onto Madison Avenue at 2:45 on a Tuesday afternoon, a time when I should have been in back-to-back meetings, solving problems, building solutions. Instead, I stood on the sidewalk, holding a box of personal items while Manhattan streamed around me, oblivious to my small corporate death. The spring air hit my lungs like freedom. I hadn't realized how stale the office air had become, recycled through the same vents for years, carrying the same conversations about synergy and optimization and disruption. Out here, the city breathed in its own chaotic rhythm, taxis honking, heels clicking on concrete, a food cart vendor arguing with a customer about hot sauce. I walked 3 blocks to the parking garage where my car waited, each step taking me further from Victor's gravitational pull. He was probably already in his office, feet up on the desk I'd helped select when we upgraded the executive floor, telling himself stories about decisive leadership and necessary changes. Let him celebrate. Let him think he'd executed a flawless corporate assassination. Let him believe that 12 years of institutional knowledge could be replaced by his Harvard MBA and management consulting playbook. In my box, beneath the framed photo of my team at last year's product launch and the coffee mug that read, "World's Okayest Project Manager," the amended NDA sat patient as a spider in its web. Not the standard one everyone signed, the special addendum Jonathan Pike had insisted on when Northbridge Tech had nearly walked away from our first major deal. They want guarantees about personnel continuity. Jonathan had said that night, exhausted after 17 hours of negotiation. They want you, specifically, locked into the project. So I'm giving them what they want, and I'm giving you something too, insurance. Never let them forget who really owns the relationships that matter. The parking garage elevator carried me up to level 4, where my 8-year-old Honda sat between a Tesla and a Maserati, a reminder that I'd never cared about the status symbols that obsessed people like Victor. I placed the box in the back seat with unnecessary gentleness, as if it contained something explosive. Which, in a way, it did. As I pulled out onto the street, merging into the Tuesday afternoon traffic, my phone began buzzing with texts from colleagues. Words of support, shock, confusion. I let them accumulate unanswered. There would be time for conversations later, after the dust settled, after Victor discovered that some evolution was actually extinction in disguise. For now, I drove home through the city I'd helped build Arden's reputation in, carrying a 12-year-old piece of paper that was about to remind everyone that in corporate warfare, the most dangerous weapons are the ones you forget exist. 3 days of silence. I'd turned off my laptop, muted Slack, and let my professional phone go straight to voicemail. Instead, I spent my time at the gym, at the farmer's market, reading books I'd bought years ago but never opened, playing the part of someone who'd simply walked away. Then, Thursday morning at 10:15, my personal phone exploded. The first text came from Janet in accounting, "What is happening?" Then Tom from development. Northbridge just called an emergency meeting. Victor's losing his mind. Sarah from reception. "Claire, please tell me you're seeing this." But it was the message from Marcus that told the real story. Northbridge is pulling the contract. They're citing breach of personnel continuity clause. Victor had no idea this existed. Legal is in full panic mode. I set my coffee down carefully on the kitchen counter, allowing myself a small smile. The dominoes were falling exactly as physics demanded they must. My phone rang unknown number with a Seattle area code. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to Margaret Stark's crisp, professional voice. "Ms. Donovan, this is Margaret Stark from Northbridge Tech's legal department. We've been attempting to reach you regarding the recent personnel changes affecting Project Meridian. Please call me at your earliest convenience to discuss the continuity clause implications." The beauty of the amendment was its simplicity. It didn't require me to take any action. The moment Victor removed me from the project without documented cause, he'd triggered a breach. Northbridge's legal team was just doing what they did best, protecting their company's interests with surgical precision. My phone buzzed again. This time, a text from someone still in the office, someone I'd helped get promoted last year. "Emergency all hands at 2 p.m. CEO flying back from London. This is insane." I made myself another coffee and settled onto my couch with a book. Phone face down on the coffee table. Every buzz was another wave crashing against Arden's foundation. Every missed call was Victor realizing the ground beneath him wasn't as solid as he'd thought. At 2:45, my phone rang with a familiar number, Adam Park, one of the senior developers who'd been with Ardent almost as long as I had. "This one," I answered. "Claire, I'm calling from the parking garage," Adam said, his voice low and urgent. "I had to tell you what just happened. The all hands was a disaster. CEO Phillips came in looking like he'd aged 5 years on the flight. Victor tried to explain that no one knew about the amendment, that it must be some kind of mistake. Phillips asked legal to pull all the Project Meridian documentation. And I asked, though I knew the answer, "Your amendment was right there, filed properly, fully executed, 12 years ago, predating every other agreement. Phillips asked Victor point blank why he hadn't reviewed the personnel obligations before making changes. Victor just stood there, mouth opening and closing like a fish. I heard Adam shift, probably checking that no one was nearby. But here's the best part. Northbridge isn't just pausing the contract. They're threatening to invoke the IP transfer clause. Apparently, if they terminate for breach, certain intellectual property rights revert to the original architect. Claire, that's you. Interesting, I said, keeping my voice neutral despite the satisfaction spreading through my chest like warm honey. Interesting, Claire. This is a $40 million account. The board is calling an emergency session tonight. I heard Phillips tell Victor to prepare a full explanation for how this happened. Adam paused. Did you know this would happen? I knew that actions have consequences, I said simply, and that good contracts are written to protect everyone's interests. Victor's trying to spin it as sabotage, says you must have hidden the amendment somehow. This time I did laugh, short and sharp. Hidden, Adam. It was filed with the state of Delaware and sits in Arden's own legal database. It's been there for 12 years. The fact that Victor didn't bother to look before he decided to play corporate executioner, that's not hiding. That's hubris. Through the phone, I heard the distant echo of the parking garage elevator. I have to go, Adam whispered. But Claire, everyone knows what really happened. Victor wanted to mark his territory, and he picked the wrong target. After he hung up, I walked to my window, looking out at the city sprawling beneath the afternoon sun. Somewhere out there, in a glass tower on Madison Avenue, Victor Hale was learning what Jonathan Pike had known 12 years ago in business. As in war, the most dangerous enemy is the one you underestimate. My phone continued its incessant buzzing texts, calls, emails to my personal account. The entire New York tech ecosystem was probably lighting up with gossip. But I didn't need to watch the explosion. I could feel its reverberations from here. Each notification, another aftershock, as Ardent Solutions discovered that their 40% revenue stream had just been weaponized against them. And we were only just getting started. The emergency board meeting started at 7 that evening. I knew because Janet texted me from the office kitchen where she was preparing coffee service for what promised to be a long night. They've locked down the executive floor. Outside counsel just arrived 3 partners from Morrison & Kemp. This is serious. Morrison & Kemp meant they'd called in the artillery. $800 an hour to clean up Victor's mess. I wondered if he was beginning to understand the magnitude of his miscalculation. By 8:30, the details began leaking out through a network of allies I'd built over 12 years. The picture they painted was beautiful in its devastation. The conference room was apparently a study in barely controlled panic. CEO Robert Phillips sat at the head of the table. His usually composed demeanor cracked like ice under pressure. The 3 board members who'd made it to the emergency session, Harold Vance, Diana Ross, and Michael Sterling, faced off against Victor, who'd positioned himself as far from Phillips as the table allowed. The lead counsel from Morrison & Kemp, a silver-haired woman named Patricia Graves, had spread the documents across the table like evidence at a murder trial. The original Northbridge contract, the amendment, the entire email chain from 12 years ago showing Jonathan Pike's negotiations, and finally, printed screenshots of Delaware state records confirming the filing. This amendment is ironclad, Patricia said, according to my source, who was taking notes from outside the glass doors. Ms. Donovan's removal without documented cause triggers 3 separate breach conditions. Northbridge has every right to terminate. Worse, if they exercise that right, the IP provisions kick in. What IP provisions? Harold Vance asked, though the tremor in his voice suggested he already suspected the answer. Patricia pulled out another document, highlighting sections in yellow. The authentication protocols, the API architecture, the client data integration framework, essentially the entire technical foundation of Project Meridian. It's all registered under a joint development agreement that names Ms. Donovan as co-creator, with ownership reverting to her if Ardent breaches. That's our entire platform, Diana Ross said, her voice barely above a whisper. That's everything. The room went silent except for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of the city 40 floors below. Then Phillips spoke, each word careful and deliberate. Victor, explain to me how you removed our most senior project lead, on whose continued involvement 40% of our revenue depends, without reviewing a single contract or consulting legal. Victor's response, as reported by multiple sources, was a masterpiece of corporate deflection. He talked about modernization, fresh perspectives, the need for agile leadership. He suggested the amendment must have been misfiled, that legal should have flagged it, that HR had cleared the restructuring. "Stop," Philip said, cutting him off mid-excuse. "Did you or did you not review the personnel obligations before removing Claire Donovan from Project Meridian?" The silence that followed was its own answer. Michael Sterling, who'd been quiet until then, leaned forward. "How much would it cost to make this go away?" Patricia Graves consulted her notes. "That depends entirely on Ms. Donovan. She holds all the cards. She could demand reinstatement, compensation, or—" She paused, letting the implication hang. She could simply let Northbridge exercise their termination rights and walk away with the IP. "She wouldn't," Victor said, but his voice cracked on the second word. "That would destroy the company." "The company?" Harold Vance turned on him, color rising in his face. "You destroyed the company the moment you decided to publicly humiliate a critical employee without doing 5 minutes of due diligence. This isn't her destroying anything. This is you lighting a match in a room full of gasoline." My phone rang, Philip's direct line. I let it ring 4 times before answering. "Robert," I said, pleasant as if we were discussing the weather. "Claire," his voice was strained, exhaustion bleeding through attempted composure. "I'm calling from the board meeting. We need to discuss the Northbridge situation." "What situation is that?" I asked, knowing full well the entire board was likely listening on speaker. "The amendment, the personnel continuity clause. Surely we can find a resolution that works for everyone." I let the silence stretch, counting to 5 in my head. Through the phone, I could hear someone whisper urgently, probably Victor, probably panicking. "Robert, I'm confused. On Tuesday, Victor made it very clear that my services were no longer required for Project Meridian. In front of 70 witnesses, are you saying that was a mistake?" "It was hasty. We should have handled things differently." "Hasty," I repeated, tasting the word. 12 years of building relationships, creating frameworks, establishing trust with our clients removed in a hastily made decision. And now you want to discuss resolution. "Claire, please, you know what this means for Ardent." "I do," I said simply. "The question is whether Victor knew when he decided to make an example of me, when he chose to humiliate me publicly without the courtesy of a conversation, when he handed my project to someone with 8 months of experience." Another whisper, urgent and angry, definitely Victor. "We can fix this," Philip said. "Tell us what you want." I smiled, though they couldn't see it. "What I want is to enjoy my evening. I suggest you consult with your legal team about the terms of the amendment. Everything is quite clearly spelled out. Good night, Robert." I hung up before he could respond, then turned my phone to silent. Let them stew in the mess Victor had created. Let them realize that sometimes the person you step on has been standing on the detonator all along. Friday morning brought the second wave of destruction. I woke at 6:30 to 17 missed calls and a text from Adam that simply read, "It's spreading." TechWave Solutions, our second largest client, had caught wind of the Northbridge situation. Their CEO, James Morrison, was old school, believed in relationships over algorithms, handshakes over PowerPoints. He'd signed with Ardent specifically because of my team's reputation. The news of my removal had reached him through the startup gossip network that connected every tech company in Manhattan. By 9, TechWave's legal department had sent a formal notice they were invoking their right to review clause, demanding a full audit of personnel changes that might affect service delivery. Translation, they were looking for their own escape hatch. Then came Pinnacle Financial. They didn't even bother with legal niceties. Their contract allowed them to demand specific team members remain on their account. Guess whose name was explicitly listed? Their notice arrived at 9:45, demanding explanation for the unauthorized personnel restructuring and threatening penalties of $50,000 per day until resolved. I knew all this because Patricia Graves called me directly at 10:15. Her professional composure barely masking desperation. "Ms. Donovan, I'm representing Ardent Solutions in this matter. We need to discuss a resolution immediately." "I'm listening," I said, stirring honey into my tea. The board is prepared to offer a substantial settlement, full severance package, accelerated vesting of all options, and a consulting agreement that would ensure smooth transition. Transition to what I've already been transitioned, publicly. Perhaps you should have called before Victor decided to execute me in front of the entire company. Patricia's sigh was audible. What would it take to resolve this? The amendment is clear. I maintain rights to the IP if removed without cause. Northbridge, TechWave, and Pinnacle are simply protecting their interests. This isn't my problem to resolve. Ms. Donovan Clare, surely you don't want to destroy the company you helped build. I set down my tea, choosing my words carefully. Patricia, I spent 12 years building those relationships. I worked 18-hour days during implementations. I flew to Seattle monthly on red-eyes to maintain FaceTime with clients. I turned down offers from Amazon and Google to stay loyal to Ardent. And in return, Victor Hale decided to make an example of me. He wanted to show everyone he was in charge, that the old guard could be discarded. Well, he's in charge now. Let him fix it. The board is reconsidering Tuesday's decision. Which board? The one that signed off on Victor's restructuring, or the one that's now panicking because they're about to lose 60% of their revenue? Another pause. I could hear muffled voices in the background. Probably the entire board huddled around a speakerphone, parsing every word. Victor was acting independently. The board didn't approve the specific personnel change. I laughed, short and bitter. Interesting. So he had authority to publicly remove me, but not authority to face the consequences. How convenient. What do you want? Patricia asked, dropping all pretense of legal maneuvering. What I wanted was to continue doing my job. That option was removed Tuesday at 9:15 in the morning. Now I want what's legally mine according to the amendment, the IP rights to the platform I co-created, as specified in the joint development agreement. The silence on the other end was deafening. Finally, Patricia spoke, her voice carefully neutral. That would effectively destroy Ardent Solutions. No, I corrected. Victor destroyed Ardent Solutions when he decided to play corporate politics without reading the rules. I'm simply collecting what's mine. Claire, please. There has to be a middle ground.